Well, thank you very much, David. Having listened to that, you gather by this that I must feel at home here. I feel like, that's the milieu where us, people who do in such in military and foreign affairs often get together. So thank you for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here. And now let's go into the easy subject of Syria. Now, of course, the whole point here was not to walk with you through that crisis, because you've been following it, and I saw that there was good press coverage, but also to take a few observations. What can we learn? Because what has been unfolding in front of our own eyes are some, admittedly, surprising things, which are taking all kind of turns. Now, the most surprising thing is, I must confess to you, is that it happened in August. You see, in my bureaucratic life, I often had the pleasure of either being the only deputy to someone or the only superior to some deputy, and we had to divide the summer between the two of us, which month you take off, which month the other takes off. And I, did a little historical study, leaving aside the First World War, that August, nothing ever happens in August. So I told the other guy, whoever it was, whether he was superior or not, I said, I take August. And hoping that, of course, nothing would transpire. Little did I know. I had revolutions, I had an invasion of Kuwait, and now we have this Syrian crisis, coming out of nowhere. Gee, everybody was on vacation, everybody was... And look at the kind of exhilarating, speed with which it is unfolding, and we have a beautiful international crisis on our hands, which on top of its being a serious business, also makes for a nice experiment to look into the nature into the conduct of international and military affairs these days. Now, just before it broke out, everything looked as if it was balanced, and there was a very tenuous equilibrium, but everything was stable. The civil war in Syria, it was, kind of a stalemate. People tended to predict that Assad would fall, he was strong for that, and people, the way he looked at it, there was nothing dramatic that was about to happen in that field. The Iranian issue, there's a new guy in Tehran. There was an anticipation of some negotiations to come, but nothing dramatic, and there was pause and even a feeling that the moment would be a moment of diplomatic efforts, nothing dramatic as well there. And then, of course, the old hat of the Middle East, the Arab-Israeli, the Israeli-Palestinian issue. We have been having these diplomatic negotiations now for the last few weeks, and all seemed quiet because it was kind of a 9 months duration that was given to it. Not much is coming out of those discussions. Nobody really expects anything of them. So there was a kind of a lethargic mood that nothing is happening and everything is essentially stable. And then things happen. And like anything else, they happen, of course, not with much almost as a matter of a lapsus. And the first event is, of course, Assad's. What exactly went wrong in his use of chemical weapons is not clear, but clearly he did not intend that effect. So he fumbled. He did use chemical weapons before, and he must have noticed that in spite of the Obama self-declared red line that this would be a game changer, nothing happened. Even when in the spring a senior Israeli intelligence official said openly, and there were Americans present in the room, that chemical weapons were being used, Washington decided to say that things are not clear. Of course they were clear, but they did not want to to abide by their commitments. So they fudged the issue. So Assad could have thought that he was not crossing any substantive threshold by using it, but it probably got beyond what he expected, too close to Damascus, too many pictures, and apparently the magnitude of the attack was more than planned. Anyway, that is what shook the world initially. But that was the catalyst. The real thing that got everything unstuck is the quickness with which the United States, who until in the last few months has just been celebrating the fact that it is withdrawing from international affairs, withdrawing its troops from other theaters, entering a period in which there would be a much more selective application of force, was very quick to say that military action would ensue. And of course you had two voices. You had Obama, who still was speaking reluctantly, but Kerry was a crusader. He very fast elevated the argumentation, which those of us who observe American foreign policy, I must assume that you're doing that from this perspective, but we are in the other neighborhood watchful too. It was breathless to see suddenly the almost complete reversal. Because what were the initial arguments for the inevitability of the use of force? That the U.S. cannot sit aside while people were being killed or slaughtered. What is it? The United States have been sitting aside in so many other instances. So what exactly has happened? Is that a new declaration? Is America assuming a new doctrine? From now on, it would intervene whenever there is a humanitarian massacre or something? Doesn't appear like it, yet that was the argument. And it was evoked in very dramatic, in highly moralistic tones, with indignation and so forth. And mind you, no American was hurt. There wasn't any direct American interest involved, national security. There wasn't any ally involved. There were not even, here America was extending in a way its protective umbrella, not to an ally to whom it may be committed by treaty or something, but to the poor civilians of another country. And by the way, when the US started to make the arguments how badly Syria was behaving, they were committing factual mistakes. For example, the first accusation was that Assad had violated the Geneva Protocol from 25. Well, he didn't, because yes, it's true that Syria is a signatory and signed long ago, but that protocol does not forbid the use of chemical weapons on your own people and on your own territory. It only precludes its use between warring parties. And for good reasons, because you know that in the interesting division of labor where you can apply force and where not, governments were always very keen that they are sovereign to use force against their own nationals. That's a prerogative governments have. You see, you commit an aggression, maybe yes, maybe not, by international law, when you attack another. But when you attack your own citizens, this is no aggression. It's a kind of a gray area. And all too often, governments have been using chemical agents in the maintenance of law and order within their own population. So what poor Assad, what does the world want from him? He was not doing anything which has not been done in a number of countries over the years. Besides, look at the indignation that followed the chemical use by Iraq. The first time that Iraq used chemical weapons against the Iranians, the reaction from the world was quite moot, because the Iranians were, very disliked, and they were the attacking party. So it was understood that in self-defense, such weapons were used. The real world indignation came when it was used against the Kurds. But then, on that, one could have absolved Saddam because he used it against his own nationals, and I think on his own territory. And that tenuous legal argumentation was made about Assad as well. So in short, to say plainly that the man violated agreements to which he was a signatory to was a factually wrong statement made by no less than the Secretary of State of the US. It was not repeated. Later on, the discussion was turned about the CWC, But here too, Syria cannot be accused of anything because it never signed the CWC. 190 nations of the world have. Most have also ratified. A couple did not ratify. Syria is among the 6 or 7 who never signed to it. Therefore, they cannot be accused of breaking anything that they were signed to. They didn't. So what can they be accused of? Of course, is crimes against humanity, horror, things that, yes. But all those legal argumentation were very flat when the U.S. first voiced them. Yet they were made with a very dramatic tone, and suddenly, and this is a thing that we must draw, all of us, including the younger generation here, which has been probably indoctrinated into thinking that the use of force is declining in utility. The only thing that the whole international crisis unfolding is because America started to seriously think about using force. That's it. It's not the pictures of the poor civilians who suffered miserably. It's the pictures of the battleships that were sailing in the direction of the Eastern Mediterranean with those cruise missiles and whatever. And it was there. And everybody could understand that we're talking about, if you were to take the pulse of the world, what's the chances of an American strike? You know, during a few days, most knowledgeable people would have given 70% probability, 80% probability. That's very high. And that concentrated the minds of everybody. So if there is one single event which has decided the issue, was the fact that out of a situation was completely stable, suddenly big America flexed its muscles. That got everything going. Practically everybody reacted to that, Israel included, because everybody from his own position was calculating the consequences of that attack. In Israel, they started to distribute gas masks. You know, that's the instinctive Israeli reaction. And then of course the Israelis, I didn't want to talk here at length about Israel, but Israel started to make all kind of declarations to deter a Syrian reaction against Israel if it were attacked by the U.S. So Israel would be the receiving end. We never got involved in the civil war. We never took any side. And yet we were supposed to brace ourselves because Assad threatened that if attacked by America, he will not hit Americans. There was no kind of threat that he would hit American targets. Only later did he, refer to some Hezbollah and some proxies acting on Syria's behalf. But initially said Jordan and Israel would be the recipients of the Syrian reaction. So that was to be expected. And of course, Israeli leaders did their own bit. They said that should the Syrians do that, of course, we'll respond with strength. Which, to my mind, I would have given pause before you do that. I mean, and I'll come to this when you talk about credibility and deterrence. But that was the instinctive. Everybody acted his part. So the Syrians did theirs. We did ours. Jordanians, others. And the Russians started to get into the game. And the Russian scheme started prematurely when it still appeared as if the American attack is imminent. Because it started, their idea that they would do something about the chemicals, and that's an old Russian idea, by the way, which has relevance to the Iranian situation. But then started the undercutting of the American credibility. The first one was that very, very tight vote in the British Parliament, which took people by surprise. And then immediately when Obama took the issue to Congress, and when people look at the votes, Congress was, in the House there was a kind of opposition of all kinds and from all directions, and also public opinion polls indicated that only a third, no more than a third of the American population would support an American military strike in Syria. So that had the effect of essentially slightly reducing the sense of inevitability of the American act. But the fact is that the Russian initiative started rolling and became an option before it came to a vote. And clearly everybody moved. And it was such a breathtaking minuet by seeing all the parties positioning themselves against the changing circumstances. And of course, Obama seized on the occasion, because I don't know what he would have done had he not had that, exit option. Either would he have flaunted Congress if it voted against? Maybe yes, maybe not. One doesn't know. People speculate, of course. So suddenly he had this option, and he seized on it. Israelis too whispered to Americans, "Yeah, do it." Why? Because we didn't want to face the even slight possibility of some escalation with the Syrians. What do we need that for? It's August. So let's have the Russian initiative. And besides, the Russian initiative is a nice metaphor to what everybody is really thinking. And what everybody is really thinking on is not Syria. It's Iran. Syria is a sideshow. Syria is a metaphor. Syria is a diversion. Syria is everything, but not the center stage. It's not. Center stage is elsewhere, but there are all too many complicated connections. So when the Russian idea came up, it was seized, it gathered momentum. You had Kerry, and now we are into a completely different game. The inevitability of the use of force has subsided, but there is an effort to keep it on the table. Mind you, latest news from today, the Russians are trying to make it so that the UN would not activate Article 7 so as to provide the legitimacy of a future use of force. And that is very much in the nature of the bargaining that is now underway. But still, the looming factor behind everything initially was the proximity of such an option and the fact that it will remain in the backdrop, as a backdrop, even as things unfold. Now I saw that great display in today's paper about the difficulties of really dismantling these chemical stuff in Syria. I must tell you, it's more than you think, because many, I suspect, also in this room are familiar with the difficulties of handling chemical stuff. We all have the experience of Iraq. We know that it's costly, dangerous, cumbersome. No one likes it. I think it is it's one of those weapons in which it is costlier to dismantle them than to build them. And sometimes you don't want to deal with it because you cannot. It's easier to get funds to acquire weapons than to get funds to dismantle weapons, so they would drop them with all kind of safety hazards and that kind of thing. So it's a monumental undertaking logistically and from an engineering point of view. On top of everything, that of course there would be efforts by the Syrians to evade, or the fact that this is a battle zone. So all these things are true when it is said about the difficulties of handling chemical stuff. But what you're not aware, and I have been all too much aware, is that the Syrians did have a formidable arsenal, and it was a serious one. To give an example, and that's inside information for you, in the last couple of years, they've taken measures to upgrade the readiness of their entire arsenal. Because, as you know, some of those things take time in order to prepare for operational use, and they have modernized their systems, and suddenly we noticed in Israel, I think about 3 years ago, that they've taken a number of steps to decrease the lag, the time between decision and activation, to about half of what it usually was. And the question, the big strategic question for Israel was, under which circumstances are they considering use? What's the purpose of this arsenal? We used to think that they considered that as their ultimate deterrent. A deterrent against maybe, possibly us marching in Damascus, Or they thought, I don't think they thought it would be an equivalent of nuclear weapons that people ascribed to Israel, but they thought this was the thing. But when we noticed that they are increasing their readiness, suspicion became that maybe they can see earlier use in the context of the initial phases of some kind of a flare-up. Maybe something in Lebanon. And that got some of us worried about the kind of restraints that they have on them in actually making use of those weapons. Is that a kind of a last resort, or is it some kind of an instrument that they can use during the evolution of some fighting? As we see now, this recent episode, in fact, the Civil War, indicates two things. First, yes, they do not have much restraints, and their threshold of use is very low. Had it been, it would have been higher in our case, maybe because we deter them. But the thought of using that, they don't have the kind of moral scruples that would inhibit early use. The new variation that we see in Syria, and one which gives you also some thoughts about other applications, that this is the first time that you see active use of such weapons in the protection of the regime. We all too often thought about non-conventional weapons and things to be used against adversaries. But in some kind of a convoluted way, to use that against your own population in a process which essentially is aimed at fortifying the position of the regime is a new use of such weapons, which could have all kind of effects to it. Makes you think about what would be nuclear weapons in the Iranian case. Could they be used in context to prevent some kind of a regime change there in the future? Well, I would assume so, yes. But in the Syrian case, it was obvious. So they do have a very modern arsenal, and their units are good, and they have a good command and control system. And as far as the Syrians go, it's a serious business. It's not a neglected part of their military. It's a main part of their military, which had been groomed and cultivated. So now one has the task of dismantling that. Will they go for it? I don't know. So, but that is still to be seen. So this is the essence of what lies ahead. What lies ahead is a prolonged period of time in which one doesn't know whether there would be political negotiations over the outcome of the civil war, the extent to which the Russians have leverage on Assad. Don't think, please, that Assad will do Moscow's bidding. This guy is an interesting character, and Russia's influence on him is limited. They cannot deliver everything. Then we'll have to see the Russian play, we'll have to see the Assad play, we'll have to see whether there would be some negotiations in Geneva or whatever that would try to resolve. If this would happen, that would be yet another unanticipated consequence of the use in which something that looked as if it was locked in some kind of a stalemate actually became unstuck, leading to possible negotiations that would bring an end to what is obviously a tragic civil war, in which many have a very high interest in resolving in one way or another, and sooner rather than later. So the final three comments I can make on this is the extent to which we can draw lessons. First, deterrence and credibility. What led Obama take that surprising action of considering seriously and flexing his muscles is the fact that he was held accountable by a commitment he made a year ago that this would be a game changer. Because at the time, he was questioned why was he not intervening in this tragic civil war, to which he said America would not intervene unless there would be use of weapons. Well, they used them, and not for the first time. So credibility became the issue. And credibility, of course, does not project on Syria. Credibility, they immediately seized on that as how will that fare when it comes to threats made in the Iranian context. So it is for credibility's sake that he had to consider action. Well, we all know that credibility is a very, very elusive kind of a thing. We've learned our lessons in history that sometimes the worst mistakes were committed because you were doing that for the sake of credibility when on its own merit it did not warrant the kind of action. And yet credibility is an essential component in the conduct of international affairs, particularly when you're making deterrent threats. Because deterrence rests on telling the other party, don't do that, or else I'll take the following thing against you, which would be punitive or prohibitive or destructive in such a way that you'll live to regret even if you succeeded. You'll regret your success. We'll make it so. That's the nature of the deterrent threat. But everything depends, therefore, on the other party being deterred. So it is in the eye of the beholder, and the eye of the beholder is the other party. And in this case, Assad was not deterred. Whether miscalculating or fumbling, the fact was that although there was an explicit American red line, which coupled with a threat of action, he wasn't deterred. That's a failure of deterrence. One should always think before making deterrent threats, because they can fail sometimes because the other guy may be silly. And then it would be your turn to do something that you may have not wanted to do when you made the threat. The threat was made only to prevent something. But once done, the balance changes. It's the ante and post conditions, and the logics do change. And here America was caught on the horns of a dilemma, and it decided to take action, although it was searching what exactly to do. They did not want to take action that would depose Assad. Why? Because the other guys are worse. That's a unique condition of the Syrian case. They did not want to punish him only. They wanted to look for some kind of a connection between what is to be targeted and what is not to be targeted. And only gradually they came into thinking that maybe they did not intend to strike at the chemical stuff. That's illogical to do. It's the diplomacy of the chemical stuff that became opportune, not this is a military target. So America was caught in a bind and acted the way it did because it became committed to a deterrent threat that it had to live by. This is why I became concerned in Israel when we have failed to learn the lesson and were very quick on threatening the Syrians with action if they act against us. And you know what our chief of staff did? Not only did he say that Israel will act, and usually the words when you make such threats are calculated and calibrated to every word. So thinking that this has been the case, the words were that the Syrian losses would be, the Syrian loss, he said, should they attack Israel, Israel would respond with its might, and the word used in Hebrew was either loss or defeat would be painful. In a way, we were promising victory, which is the converse of defeat to the Syrians. What is this? What happens if our bluff were to be called? Why did we have to say it? And besides, why do you have to say it openly? Not all deterrent threats have to be said publicly. We can convey the threat practically with the speed of this to Bashar Assad directly without carrying the consequences of having to live by it because we made it publicly. But once, as Obama did, made a threat publicly, he was held, to his word by the whole world. So all this management of deterrent threats has been demonstrated here to be very problematic. And in the case of Obama, it trapped him into something that he may not have wanted. He may emerge out of it, victorious. Who knows? But this is not what he intended. The same is true about the drawing of red lines. You draw a red line, or a deadline, or an ultimatum. You have to act upon it. So you have here the complicated mechanics of having to use those instruments because they exist, but you have to understand exactly how they operate, and you have to know that sometimes they are very difficult to get a hold of. So we had in this case a very good example of the application of threats, of deterrent threats. And by the way, to this day, this is part of the American equation. They say that if they do take action, it would be to punish. And again, they elevate that to a kind of a universal principle. People who would use chemical weapons should be punished for doing so. And the question remains an open question whether that is a new universal American doctrine that they will apply anywhere, anytime, if there is such a violation. One doesn't know. Now there is final word about legitimacy. We saw here an exercise in the need for legitimacy even for the United States. That is to say, it's not enough that you decide, you have to back it up. And indeed, the erosion in the American position came first because an ally, a trusted ally, suddenly moved aside. That is, after all, this support coming from our allies, from the like-minded, in this case Britain, which in American eyes has always been a mainstay of support. Once that happened, that eroded the international community's legitimacy for the American step. Then the second aspect came from inside, when American public opinion and congressional opinion turned into not being favorable. That also reduced the legitimacy. And finally, all kind of questioning coming from the world about the validity of the arguments made until the Russians offered the formula that they did. You see here that managing the legitimacy issue is becoming a very, very tricky thing, and that remains a key issue because on all three elements that I just referred to, deterrence, credibility, and legitimacy, they all are relevant to the management of the Iranian crisis. Each one, and the possible future application of force, depends on future legitimacy, which, let me just conclude by saying, is much riper in the case of the Iranian case than the Syrian case. Because on Iran, there are already United Nations security resolutions, some under Article 7. Second, public opinion in America is much more favorable to act in last resort militarily in Iran than it was in Syria. And third, American commitments in the Iranian case have been much more explicit, saying the U.S. is determined to prevent nuclear Iran. But that's another story. In short, all of us who have seen things happening have yet another experience of a new type of a crisis unfolding behind, in front of everybody, being managed by the top leaders of the world, doing that in the full glare and not doing that in close quarters. Although there are some hidden things that are happening, by and large, the crisis was there. All of them misreading the situation. All of them getting caught by surprise, and the greatest of surprises to each and one of them is that they acted in ways that were different than when what they thought they were about to do when they entered this exercise. Now, had this not been essentially a tragic situation with the loss of life and serious business, I would consider that a very, very nice comedy, of the kind that we saw, people entering doors, coming out of doors and everything. So there is a certain comic element to it, but let's keep this conversation serious, and let me stop here. I just shared with you some observations and insight, but please challenge them, share your observations, and thank you.
We do have some time for some questions.
I'd like to break the ice first. Somebody that you used to work for drew a line of his own in front of the United Nations General Assembly not too long ago, a red line. So would you say that the same imperatives apply to his drawing of the red line and the possible need to back it up or lose credibility, as you just pointed out we've got with the United States and Syria?
Yes, look, there was an interesting exchange exactly a year ago, as you said, between America and Israel about the value of drawing red lines. We all know about the risks and benefits of it. The question at the time was about the specific circumstance and the utility. Netanyahu thought that since the Iranians were proceeding gradually and the nature of their program is cumulative, they are gathering equipment, they are gathering enriched material, they are proceeding steadily, that they have to be told not to cross a certain line beyond which the conditions would be that they would force others to intervene. So the justification for the red line there was to make them stop short of that, and by stopping short of that, staying further away from being able to assemble a bomb or to construct a bomb. And the Israeli thought was that although the Americans' position on Iran was on a declaratory basis pretty explicit, and I will repeat what the United States said another time, that it is determined to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. Sometimes even from developing, sometimes acquiring. This is not a trivial difference, but that was a statement. The second statement that had been said repeatedly, that all options are on the table, implying the military too. The third variation of the same was said that it would come relevant as a last resort if all other means to accomplish the goal were to fail. And finally, it used to be said that the president repeatedly said, I am not in the mood or the mold of reconciling ourselves to a nuclear Iran and falling into a position of containment and deterrence. No, I'm still in the mood of prevention, namely using various instruments to prevent Iran from getting there. Now, that is a general statement, but at no point did America establish benchmarks. It didn't say at which point would it consider that the advance was getting too close for comfort. And in fact, it was getting too close for comfort through a number of variables. One is what we Israelis called the zone of immunity. There was a certain point beyond which we were not sure that we could catch them if they break out and rush, to construct something. So that was the zone of immunity decided. There was another one which simply were the kind of benchmarks, whether they will proceed with enriching uranium to military grade, which clearly was not for civilian use, and that was indicative, and that was also getting them closer, and that was the essence of his diagram, which in a way was sloppily prepared.
By Stefan Ziel's videographer.
Yeah. No, but the 90% thing, it was misleading.
Yeah.
What was meant, that 90% effort, not 90% enrichment of the uranium. But people thought that it was 90%. No, he meant the 20%, getting to a 20% enrichment constitutes 90% of the effort in the process. But, after some corrections, the Iranians got the message right, and indeed they are not crossing that. They are getting close, and then they do not accumulate sufficient quantity, but then they convert it to something else. So that was, so Netanyahu felt that, I think, that it was high time that the Iranians be confronted with more than one red line. Some in terms of time, because America did say that the process is not open-ended. Fine, so just say how not open-ended it is. Give diplomacy a set time. And others could have been tangible things. 20% enrichment could be one, not activating Fordo could be another, not installing new centrifuges. You can have some tangibles. He wanted America to make these America's red lines. And the administration refused. All this happened during the summer
which was a summer that both parties would like to forget, when it appeared as if Israel was siding with Obama's rivals in elections, and the mood was very sour between these two leaders.